Welcome to another episode of Mike's Money Picks. Today on the podcast, we're going to be breaking down the Friday, February 23rd slate of college basketball DFS for DraftKings. It does not appear as if FanDuel is going to have a slate for this Friday, which I'm kind of not expecting them to. They don't have it out yet if they're planning on having one, because guess what, y'all? We have a true mid-major Friday slate. This is what we have seen the norm of the last 2 to 3 seasons in college basketball DFS, where we don't have any power conferences in action on Friday. We've got 4-game slate on DraftKings where we've got one battle in the MAC. That's right, we got some action going on. And then we've got a big time game in the Ivy League, a game in the A10, and then what is likely a blowout nightcap in the Mountain West. So this is going to be the type of slate where if you're willing to dig deep and do some extra research, which judging by the fact that you're watching this show, you probably are, there is a little bit of an edge to be gained on this slate, in my opinion, because the public knowledge of these teams is not going to be as much as it would be for a normal slate. You're going to be playing a lot of guys on this slate that you may not have ever heard of or watched play, but that's okay because here on this episode, we're going to break down all 4 of these games with all the pertinent players and teams and stats and information that you need to know so that way you can make some informed, educated decisions to build your lineups on DraftKings for the Friday night slate. Now, I do hope to be back here with you talking, the Saturday slate and the Sunday slate. I'm not going to make any promises, though. As I've kind of been updating you guys throughout the weeks here, my daughter is closing in on 6 months old now, and she's not exactly sleeping every night. So, there are some nights where I had to take a night off just so I can get some extra sleep or attempt to get some extra sleep. Pretty much every slate is just going to be kind of like touch and go in terms of whether or not I have an episode. But I will say this. Go ahead and join the Fantasy Corner Discord. The link is in the description on YouTube as well as on the audio feed. The Fantasy Corner Discord is a lot of smart people who play a lot of DFS for a lot of different sports, and the college basketball chat has been popping in there recently. We've had a lot of winners. We've had a lot of people join that are really contributing good things to the conversation, and just all day we're just in there talking plays, lineup, strategy, builds, and then at night it's sweating it out together, and it's a blast. And so if you ever want my thoughts on a slate that I don't have a video or a podcast for, the Fantasy Corner Discord is the place where you can get that. But also, if you subscribe to the channel and to the audio feed, you can get notified when new episodes drops. That way, whether I do or do not have an episode, you are well aware of that fact. All right, so with that being said, let's go ahead and start and kick things off with some action here on this Friday night. So let's kick things off with a battle in the MAC where Toledo is taking on Bowling Green. And this is an important game down the stretch in the MAC, y'all, as Toledo aims to, attempt to be the regular season champion of the MAC. And y'all, this is going to be probably the best game environment of the night to target, in my opinion. It has the highest total of the night according to KenPom. KenPom has this game projected to be 79 to 76 in favor of Toledo. I guess you could say everybody wants a piece of the MACtion. And I'm realizing now after I said it that is referencing a song that is almost 50 years old. I don't know how many of you guys got that reference. If you're a classic rock aficionado, you probably did. But if not, that's okay. Probably went over your head. And I realized that was not the best joke choice. Anyway, this is a really good game environment is the bottom line of what I was trying to say there. The previous meeting between these two teams did see 160 total points scored as it was 88 to 72 in favor of Toledo. And y'all, these two teams are just perfect teams to target against in DraftKings in DFS. So if they're both good teams to target against, that makes them good teams to target for, right? And so Toledo, here's why we like targeting them. They rank 78th in the nation in tempo, and they rank 260th in the nation in defensive efficiency. That's a good combination because you're getting a lot of possessions against a bad defense. Bowling Green ranks 128th in tempo, 223rd in defensive efficiency, but they rank 319th in the nation in 3-point percentage allowed. And so basically, Bowling Green's allowing teams to hit a lot of threes on them. And, I'm a high school math teacher. I know that 3 is greater than 2. So with that being said, this is just a recipe for a lot of fantasy points being scored. And in the first meeting, there were a lot of fantasy points that were scored. We've had Toledo on a few slates already, and we've talked about their big 3 guards, Moss, Cochran, and Maddox, and they all got there in the first game against Bowling Green. Raheem Moss is their highest usage player on the season. To me, he is a very high floor play. He's had 27 fantasy points or more in 8 straight games, one of which was that game against Bowling Green, where he put up 39 fantasy points on only 5 for 13 shooting, 1 for 8 from behind the arc. So I think you could make the argument that, with as well as he played, he could even see some regression in shooting and could have a ceiling much higher than that. He doesn't necessarily have a massive ceiling, but I definitely like what you're getting with the floor and the previous performance with Raheem Moss. Tyler Cochran has been my favorite of the 3 Toledo guards to play. because he's got a similar shot rate to the other two, but he tends to get more rebounds as he plays the small ball for this Toledo team. And we love the consistency that we're getting with Tyler Cochran. He's put up 25 fantasy points or more in 10 straight games, and he had 46 in the first matchup against Bowling Green. My word of caution in that one, though, is that he did have 5 steals, which is, that's a probably not going to happen again, even though he does get 2 steals a game. But, even if you take that away, you're still looking at around 40 fantasy points if he was just at his average. So I definitely think this is a good recipe for Tyler Cochran. He is not exactly the most prolific 3-point shooter they have against Bowling Green, who is a poor 3-point defense, but he tends to get a lot of shots, and the increased possessions from the tempo on both sides is going to give him plenty of opportunities to get a lot of boards. I do like Tyler Cochran a lot. I also like the third guard, Dante Maddox. He has been probably the least consistent of the 3 guards. He only has had, he's not had the same floor that the other 2 have, but he has had a ceiling. He has had 2 games over 40 fantasy points in his last 7, one of which was 41 fantasy points against Bowling Green. But in that game, he was 8 for 9 from the field and 6 for 7 from behind the arc. So that's a tough performance to repeat, in my opinion. But he is a guy who has shown that ceiling, because since then he's had another 40 piece as well as 36.75 against Ohio. So the ceiling is definitely there with Maddox. If you're worried about the ceiling of the other 2, both Cochran and Moss have had 1 game over 40 fantasy points in that same time span. So with Maddox, you are not getting the security that you have with Moss or with Cochran, but you are getting a guy who can absolutely get hot from behind the arc and light it up. And Bowling Green is a good team that you can light it up against. Now, we've also played Javen Simmons a lot. Yeah, I've been told it's Javen, not Javon. I've been calling him Javon. Sorry, buddy. Javen Simmons, we've been playing a lot when Toledo's been on the slate, because he is their primary big. He plays a ton of minutes too. And he put up 26 fantasy points in 35 minutes the first time they played Bowling Green. And that was on 16% usage. So the interesting thing about that is he had a 19% usage rate over the course of the entire season. So basically what I'm saying is he didn't have anything in that performance, the 26, that makes me think it's not repeatable. And if he were to see more usage, then I definitely think that could unlock a higher ceiling, which he has certainly shown since then. I would prefer him to be a little bit cheaper like he was last time we saw him on the slate, but I do think that Javen Simmons is a solid play at $7,400. I'm definitely going to be getting a lot of pieces of at least one of those big 4 for Toledo. Now, after those big 4, we got to talk about Sonny Wilson. So Sonny Wilson only had 7 fantasy points in that last game against Bowling Green. But since then, he has been really good for this Toledo team. His last 3 games, he's had 30, 18, and 27. He's seen his usage jump in that, and he actually led the team in usage rate in their last game against Akron. So I definitely think there's a little bit of upside, and I definitely think he makes for a great contrarian play from the likes of Moss and Maddox. Now, after that, they don't really use a whole lot of bench guys. Sam Lewis will play off the bench, generally between 10 to 18 minutes, played 11, put up 5 fantasy points against Bowling Green the first time. And then Andre Lawrenson is their big off the bench, and he played 15 minutes against Bowling Green, put up 11 fantasy points. So, not options you can totally count out, especially if one of those guys in the starting lineup gets in foul trouble, but they're just not super consistent options because you've seen such heavy minutes to that starting 5. Now, Bowling Green is a team that we definitely want to target as well, even though the last game they played against Toledo was not as successful, because Toledo gives up a lot of 2-point shots. Toledo ranks 360th in the nation out of 362 teams in 2-point field goal percentage allowed. So basically, if you're able to get in the paint, you're going to be able to score on this Toledo team. And fortunately for Bowling Green, they have 2 guys who will do that in Marcus Hill and Rashawn Ajee. They're the only 2 guys on the team who are above 19% usage on the season. Now, in that first game against Toledo, Marcus Hill was able to put up 33 fantasy points, 33.5 to be exact, on 10 for 22 shooting. And he had a 39% usage rate in that game. So you got to feel like if you see the same usage rate again out of Hill that we saw in that first matchup, you got to feel like he's going to be able to get to that lofty fantasy point total again. And I think even at a salary of $8,200, he's certainly in play, especially if you want to stack it up. We've seen him take a ton of shots recently. Now, Rashawn Ajee was not exactly as successful in that game. He only had 19.8 fantasy points against Toledo, 19.75 to be exact, on 27% usage in that game. And he only played 27 minutes. He was dealing with foul trouble a little bit in that game. And we've seen him play 27 minutes or more in every game since. So to me, the hope on a G would be that he could stay on the floor at the same usage rate that he had in that game. And that would allow him to hit his ceiling, which he's been pretty good at recently. Out of his last 5 games, he's had 2 games over 40 fantasy points. So there's definitely a ceiling there with a G, but you're really going to need him to stay on the floor against this Toledo team and stay out of foul trouble. To me, that is a risk you are running if you play him, but there is definitely upside there. Jason Spurgeon is an interesting one because he's a 7-footer that, like, on paper against Toledo's small ball lineup should be able to take advantage of their lack of size. But the last time they played, he was okay, put up 23 fantasy points on 5 for 8 shooting on 36 minutes played. So, like, I don't really see a way for him to exceed that. And at $7,000, you're going to want him to exceed that. He has not been great since that game. Only once since that Toledo game has he hit 4x value. So I just think he's a little bit overpriced, and he's probably not a guy I'm going to get to. I would rather pay up for a G or Hill on the Bowling Green side, or I would pay down to Trey Thomas, who is Bowling Green's best 3-point shooter. It appeared that Toledo's plan the first game was to try to make Bowling Green chuck threes because Bowling Green is not a great 3-point shooting team. And so in that game, Trey Thomas got 7 looks from behind the arc, went 2 for 7, and put up 15 fantasy points. And he's generally a better 3-point shooter than that. So I could definitely see Trey Thomas having a bigger game here this one. At only $5,500, he's a great game stacking piece in my opinion. Now, after that, it gets a little bit dicey for this Toledo team. So Dejon Humphrey did not play in their last game. He is normally a starter. He is normally one of their better players. And the internet is like radio silent on why he did not play in that game. I can't find anything. I can't find anything on his status for this game. So definitely get an update with this being the first game of the slate. If Humphrey is going to play, he's probably going to be the next best option on this team if he does. In Humphrey's absence, Deshaun Phillip played a ton of minutes in their last game against Central Michigan, but he only turned it into 14 fantasy points. He is kind of a cardio guy against Toledo the last time. He absolutely went off, though. He was not a cardio guy against Toledo. He put up 31 fantasy points on 31 minutes played. So he would probably be a guy that has a ton of upside at a salary of only $4,600, especially as a game stacking piece. And I like him even more if Humphrey sits because we just saw in that last game that he's going to play a ton of minutes if Humphrey is out of the lineup. So Deshaun Phillip, definitely an interesting value play. After that, Sam Towns is really the only other bench player who plays. He's the only bench player who played double-digit minutes in their last game. He played 24 minutes and put up 19 fantasy points. I feel much better about him because he was coming off of an injury as well. I feel much better about him if Humphrey is out. If Humphrey's back in, I think Humphrey's going to slide right into a lot of the minutes that Towns had and a lot of the minutes that Phillip got. All right, so that does it for the first game. Let's go ahead and move on over to game number 2, a battle in the Ivy League between Yale and Cornell. KenPom has this one projected to be Cornell 77-76 for a total of 153 points. That's pretty solid. The first time these two teams played, it was 158 points scored as Yale won 80-78 on their home floor. Now, Yale is not exactly a team that's great to target, though. Yale ranks 311th in the nation in tempo, but they give up a ton of threes and a ton of assists. So while there are less possessions in a Yale game, those possessions do have a chance to yield more fantasy points. Cornell, on the other hand, is a great team to target. It's definitely a plus matchup for Yale because Cornell ranks 25th in the nation in tempo. So you're going to see a Yale team that is paced up in this one and going to get more possessions than they're used to. So how can that play out in this slate? Well, Danny Wolf is Yale's best player. He's a 7-footer who can score at all 3 levels. He can distribute as well. I've been impressed with him the times that I have watched Yale. He has a 27% usage rate on the season. In the last game against Cornell, he had 41 fantasy points on a 29% usage rate. So that's definitely repeatable and sustainable in my opinion. The fact that his usage rate wasn't that much higher than his season average, his minutes played wasn't that much higher than his season average, his fantasy point total wasn't that much higher than his season average. So I definitely feel like that's a very sustainable performance, and he has earned the right to be the highest priced player on the slate. Now, Bezin Bang is second on the team in usage on the season, and I like him a lot in fantasy as well. He averages 22% usage rate on the season. Against Cornell, he put up 28.5 fantasy points, but he only needed a 15% usage rate to get there. He did not see as big of a usage rate beat, but because Cornell is boosting the number of possessions, you got a guy in Mbang who is getting a ton of peripheral stats and rebounds, assists, and steals, and that's going to allow him to get his fantasy point total, even if the usage isn't exactly there. That also was one of his 4 straight games over 28 fantasy points. Like the Toledo guys that are higher priced, I think he is a very safe high floor option, and I think he is a great cash game option at 7,400. And I think in GPPs, he might make a contrarian play to play him without Danny Wolf and hope that maybe Wolf can get in foul trouble and Mbang can carry the team. Now, after those two, there's not a whole lot of high usage guys on the team. August Mahoney is just kind of meh, if I can be honest. Like, he plays a lot of minutes. He takes a decent amount of shots. He's generally good for 17 to 20 fantasy points, but he's priced at $5,900, and we want more than that out of $5,900. John Poulakidis, I think I said that correctly. Poulakidis has seen his shot rate jump in the last 2 games. More on that in a second. But in those 2 games, he's put up 21 and 17 fantasy points. So even with additional shots, he's not exactly turning into games that are 4 and 5x value because he doesn't put up a whole lot of peripheral stats. In the game against Cornell, he took 10 shots and put up 20.5 fantasy points. If he were $5,200, not $6,200, I'd call him one of the best plays on the slate. But unfortunately, he's sitting there at $6,200, and he's not going to be one of my favorites. Now, the reason why his shot rate jumped is because their power forward, Matt Nolan, has been out for the last 2 games, and it does not seem like he's going to be back for this game. I don't know enough to say for certain. It's tough to find information on this one, but if he's out again, you're definitely going to see more shots from Poulakidis, more usage from Wolf and Mbang. But if Nolan is out, what you really have seen in the last 2 games is a ton of minutes from Nick Townsend. He's played 31 and 34 minutes. He hasn't put up more than 15 fantasy points in either of those 2 games. But if he's going to play 30-plus minutes against a Cornell team that's going to pace him up at $4,400, he's got a great chance to return you 4 or 5x value. In the first game against Cornell, he only played 15 minutes and put up 16.75 fantasy points. So if you double the minutes and theoretically double the fantasy points, that's like 33 fantasy points. I'm not saying he's going to be able to do that again, but if he plays at the same minutes load he's seen without Nolan in a matchup that he's had success with in limited minutes against Cornell, that's a combination for a really good night, and I think he's one of the best value plays on the slate. Now, Yale's bench is going to be a little bit between Simmons, Graham, and Malloy. Maybe Garum is how you pronounce that. Simmons, Garum, and Malloy. Not super excited about any of them, though. They haven't really seen that big of a boost without Nolan either. It's really been Townsend that's been the primary beneficiary, and then Poulakidis getting the shots. All right, now, on the Cornell side, this is a very unique statistical profile, okay? So let's start things off by talking about Chris Mannon. He has been their usage leader on the season. He's been their best player on the season. He's very efficient. He shoots the ball at about 58% from the field on the season, which you typically don't see out of high usage guards in college basketball. He's had 35 fantasy points or more in 2 of his last 3 and 40 fantasy points or more in 5 of his last 8. And you guessed it correctly. One of those 35 fantasy point games was against Yale, where he went 9 for 11 from the field. The only thing that kind of caps his upside is the fact that he rarely plays over 30 minutes. If they were willing to play him 30, 35 minutes, this guy would have legitimate 50 fantasy point upside because he is that efficient and he does play at that high of a usage rate. But I can't sit here and guarantee that he's going to get more than 25 to 28 minutes. And so that makes him a really tough target. And I wish I could target him, but we just can't. And I wish he had more upside than what he did because of that minute total. Now, after that, for the record, I do think Mannon is probably the best game stacking play on the Cornell side. If you're going to stack one guy on 1 or 2 guys on Yale with one person on Cornell, it's probably going to be Mannon, right? But after that, you've got Nazir Williams, Isaiah Gray, and Sean Hansen, who all start, who all have over 20% usage, and none of the 3 of them scored over 21 fantasy points against Yale. Like Mannon, neither of them play a ton of minutes. Neither of them have super great rebounding and assist rate. They're all decent, but they're not great. And so the fact that they're not playing a whole lot of minutes just limits their upside. And so Cornell, play your best players. If they played their best players 30 plus minutes, like they would be really easy to target, especially at the price tags they're at right now. But with them not playing a big minute total, they're really tough to target. Now, we mentioned that Hansen is the starter, but Guy Ragland actually plays slightly more minutes than Hansen at the center position, but they pretty much split the minutes like dead down the middle, 55-45. Ragland plays at a higher usage rate. He only put up 16 fantasy points against Yale, and the fact that they're splitting minutes does cap his upside, and I wish he was cheaper than $6,000. Between the two of them, I would be much more likely to play Hansen at a cheaper price tag. Now, after that, Cooper Nord is the fifth starter, but he has games where he just disappears, like the first time against Yale, where he went over 2 from the field and only put up 1.25 fantasy points. So just even though this is a great game environment, there's not a lot to love on this Cornell side. After that, the bench has been Okereke, Feigen, and Boothby. Those have been the 3 guys that they've played off the bench. Feigen probably has the best statistical profile because he does play a lot of minutes. He does take a decent amount of shots. Last 2 games, he's put up 24 and 20 fantasy points. He would probably be the most likely value play that I would get from this Cornell side. But like I said, the fact that they all split minutes like dead down the middle just makes it really tough to target. I think Manin probably has the most upside because if he did ever play a ton of minutes, he's going to put up a ton of fantasy points. And then I think Feigen's my favorite value play because of what he's done recently. All right, so let's take a quick breather and then let's talk about the last 2 games of the night. All right, so game number 3 on the slate is going to be Duquesne heading to the Bronx to take on Fordham. And this one is not exactly a battle between the top teams in the Atlantic 10, just to put it that way. But it is a battle in the A10. This one, KenPom has projected to be 72-67 in favor of Duquesne. That is the lowest total on the slate. This is also a rematch. Earlier in the season, Duquesne won 68-59 when these 2 teams played. So, very low, 127-point total on that one with a projection of 139 here Friday night. Fordham does like to get up and down, but Duquesne plays very slow. Duquesne is also very defensive oriented. So, not exactly a great environment for producing a lot of fantasy points, but I do think there are a few individual plays we can get to. Now, on the Duquesne side, Jimmy Clark is their usage leader at 29% on the season, but I think he's a little bit of a misprice. I've kind of said that about a lot of guys on this slate. Maybe this slate, I just need to lower my standards a little bit and just be okay if a guy just barely gets to 4x, because on a 4-game slate, 200 will most likely get you to min cash unless one of these games just goes crazy. Anyway, Jimmy Clark. He's only been over 4x value once in his last 6. However, that was a 47 fantasy point performance against St. Louis. And he had 25 fantasy points in the previous meeting against Fordham, was 3 for 10 shooting in that game, which is not like him. So, maybe there's a chance for him to have a little bit better game in this one. I don't know, but I do think he's a little bit overpriced, and I would rather play some of the other guys who are priced near him. Day Grant, though, is their leading scorer. He's one of the better scorers in the Atlantic 10. He almost equals Clark in shot rate, which, if I'm being honest, if you're Duquesne, if you want to be better, maybe let your best scorer take more shots than the other guys. Just a thought. Anyway, he had 15 fantasy points against Fordham the first time, only played 24 minutes. That game, he was returning from an injury. He was out for about 2 weeks, and he came off the bench. And since then, he's been pretty solid. He's had 245 or more fantasy point performances in the 7 games since he has returned to the starting lineup after that injury. So Day Grant definitely has a little bit of upside. I definitely think he is a really interesting GPP play because with all the guards from the Yale and Cornell and the Toledo and Bowling Green game priced right around him, you're getting a guy who has the same amount of upside and is going to get like minuscule ownership compared to the other guys that are in that range. So I definitely think Day Grant is a very sneaky GPP play. David Dixon is their primary forward in terms of like offensive usage. His minutes have been up and down. His fantasy point performances have been up and down. But he did move into the starting lineup 2 games ago. And in those 2 games, it's been mixed results, 44 and 12 fantasy points. I guess if you were to average that together, that would average out to 28 fantasy points, which would be pretty good. But you don't really know what you're going to get out of these Duquesne bigs. They tend to get in foul trouble a lot as well. So you will see minutes from Fousseyni Drame, transfer from St. Peter's, and Dusan Mahorcic, transfer from NC State. Both those guys are going to play minutes, and they tend to be pretty high usage guys when they're out there. I don't have a whole lot of optimism for them, but hey, they're options, right? It's a 4-game slate. You're going to need to find some value plays somewhere. Drame and Mahorcic will play minutes. Trey Williams was also moved into the starting lineup last game in place of Kareem Rozier. And he was okay. He put up 17 fantasy points in 21 minutes. I would have liked for his price tag to be a little bit lower, considering he had done like nothing before that game. But if he's going to start and he's going to play 21 plus minutes, like he's worth a look at $4,600. After that, the one guy I do want to talk about, this guy feels like the one mispriced on the slate. It's Jake DeMichelle. So he has been really, really solid for this Duquesne team lately. He is a freshman, and it seems like they are giving him more minutes, giving him more usage to kind of, get his feet wet, playing on the future, and hopefully try to keep him around because they need something to go right at Duquesne. That's been a very not great basketball program for the last decade. But he feels like he could be a guy for them for the future, and he's playing well in the present. In his last 5 games, he's averaging 20.6 fantasy points, which is considerably higher than I would expect for a guy at $4,400, and is probably making him one of the biggest misprices on the slate at $4,400. So I think he's going to be super duper popular. I think what a lot of builds are going to do are just going to, when they start building, they're going to slap in DeMichelle and then slap in Townsend for Yale, both at $4,400, and use those as their two value plays. I think that's going to be a very common start on Friday night. So if you do plan on starting with those two guys, figure out a way to make your lineup different elsewhere, because I think those are going to be the two value plays that everybody's going after, but for very good reason. Now, on the Fordham side, this is a team that is just tough to figure out. All right, so y'all ready for all this information? It's going to be a lot, okay? Their starting 5 in their last game was Jeffet Medor, Will Richardson, Kyle Rose, Ramad Dean, and Elijah Gray. Their bench that they have used in the last 3 or so games has been Simbila, Charlton, Tripp, and Rivera. Those have been the guys who have been the primary bench players for them. All right. Now, Kyle Rose is their highest priced guy. He has been surging lately in terms of his fantasy production. Last game against Davidson, he only had 9.5 fantasy points. He dealt with foul trouble. But before that, the previous 4 games were 47, 34, 24, and 35. And that had not been typical of what he had been doing throughout the entirety of the season. He has these stretches where he just gets hot and gets going, and then he kind of has some dud games, and then he's really unpredictable. He generally plays a lot of minutes, but you have no idea how many shots he's going to get to take or how many shots he's going to get to make. Does he have upside? Yes, but I'll warn you, his season-long rates are not that great, but his usage rates in the last 5 games have been pretty good. So he is just kind of like a GPP play lightning in a bottle type of play, where maybe you play him at $7,200 at 5% ownership and he gives you 35 fantasy points. That's probably best case scenario with Kyle Rose. Will Richardson is a guy who plays a ton of minutes for them at the 2. Doesn't do a whole lot else outside of score, and because of that reason doesn't accumulate as much fantasy points as we want for a guy at his salary. Only once in conference play has he been above 26 fantasy points, and that is just not what we want for a guy who's priced at $6,600, right? Like, that's about 4x, and we want more than that if we're playing a guy at 6,600. So he is probably a pass, in my opinion. I think you can get better values elsewhere. Medor is probably their most consistent best player throughout the entirety of the season. But he had an absolute dud against Davidson. Only put up 2 fantasy points in that game, had more turnovers than points, had 4 fouls as well. But on the season, he is their usage leader. He has a very high assist rate. And so if Fordham is going to, contend in this game and put up a lot of points, it's probably going to be because of Medor. But oh, by the way, in the previous game against Duquesne, he also dealt with foul trouble, only played 15 minutes, put up 8 fantasy points. That's not exactly a good recipe, but if you're a season-long usage rate truther, Medor would be the guy that you would want to go with. Now, Elijah Gray is the guy who had a lot of success against Duquesne the first time these two teams played. He played 32 minutes, which was his high for all the A10 conference games. Took 13 shots, which is the second highest in all, or third highest, excuse me, in all the A10 conference games. And he ended up with 36 fantasy points, which is the high that he has gotten in all A10 conference games. We have seen this with Duquesne, where they are not all that big, their bigs that they do play love to foul, and they can just get battered down low by bigs. And even in the A10, where there's not a whole lot of quality bigs, Deron Holmes absolutely went off against him, and Elijah Gray absolutely went off against him. So maybe there's a little something there that he can repeat that performance. And only $5,500, you don't have to pay a lot to find out. He's been pretty good. Well, I don't want to say pretty good. He's been okay, but over the whole season. But against Duquesne, he's been great. 38 fantasy points in that game. Now, Charlton. Antrell Charlton also was successful in that first game against Duquesne, put up 25 fantasy points on 34 minutes played. However, he has not played more than 27 minutes in a game since then, and the 27 minutes that he did play were against Davidson, where all their other guards were dealing with foul trouble. So there's just not a whole lot to get excited about on this Fordham side because they're just not really all that predictable, right? Now, I will mention Joshua Rivera is priced at $3,000 on DraftKings. His game log is not updated. His game log stops at December 16th. He has played games since then. He averages 19.5 fantasy points per game on DraftKings. That is not accurate. He does not average 19.5. In my opinion, looking at his recent box scores without doing all of the math, because that would take me forever, he is probably about a 3,800 player who is going to get between 12 to 20 minutes. And he probably is a little bit of a misprice, but he's not like the super obvious 3K misprice. If DraftKings gets his game log updated, it might provide us a little more of a picture. He probably should not be 3K, but he's also not a guy you should just be locking into your lineups because he actually averages 6x his salary. That's also not accurate either. So just thought I would get that out there. The DraftKings might have been a little bit asleep at the wheel when it comes to Rivera. All right, now let's go ahead and move on to the last game of the slate, which is going to be Nevada at San Jose State. And this is probably going to be the ugliest game on the slate, in my opinion, not from necessarily a lack of scoring, but a lack of competitiveness. KenPom has this one projected to be 76 to 66 in favor of Nevada. However, these two teams have already played, and in that first meeting, Nevada walloped them. It was 90 to 60 in favor of the Wolfpack. And in that game, it was the Nick Davidson game. The power forward for Nevada just absolutely went off, put up 42 fantasy points in 26 minutes. That is about a fantasy point and a half per minute, which is just an insane pace. And if he were able to play 30 minutes, then that would be like 47 fantasy points. So definitely a guy that has my interest. And, even if you're worried about the blowout risk, that doesn't have to be a concern because if he's going to put up fantasy points at the same rate, all he needs is 24 minutes and he's going to be able to give you big time value. So definitely a guy that I have really high hopes for here on this slate is Nick Davidson. Now, Keenan Blackshear was kind of the guy that got left out in that blowout against San Jose State. He only played 17 minutes. He dealt with first half foul trouble. And by the time the second half came around, the game was kind of already over. But even in 17 minutes, he was able to put up 22 fantasy points and still had a pretty high usage rate in that time as well. And so if he's able to stay out of foul trouble, if he's able to stay on the floor and just give you 25 minutes, that's probably a recipe for getting like 30 to 35 fantasy points. And he's a guy who tends to be really correlated with Nevada's team total because he puts up so many peripheral stats in terms of rebounds and assists, averages about 5 per game in both categories. So I think Keenan Blackshear is a guy who does have a lot of upside, but he's going to have to stay on the floor in this one. Now, in his absence, Jared Lucas, who I've affectionately called the AJ Storr of the Mountain West because all he does is score, he took over some of the distributing role in that game against San Jose State. Played 28 minutes, put up 32 fantasy points. Definitely the more on-ball usage type role for Lucas did him well in terms of fantasy scoring. I'm not optimistic for Lucas as I am about Blackshear or Davidson, but he's a guy who has the capability of just absolutely getting hot. He's going to get shots. There's definitely a pathway there to him having a ceiling game. After that, I'm not really super interested in the other two starters for Nevada. Daniel Foster is a bench guard who's going to play minutes no matter what the game flow looks like, whether it's close or a blowout. But they do have some guys on this Nevada team who have benefited strongly from a blowout. and it is Tyler Rollison, Hunter McIntosh, and Tillin Pope. Rollison is the traditional backup point guard behind Blackshear. In that game against San Jose State, he played 18 minutes, put up 17 fantasy points, which we will take on this slate as salary of $4,200. He's also seen extended run and blowouts. Hunter McIntosh is another guy who comes off the bench, is not a super big minutes guy, but when he's out there, he tends to put up stats, whether it's through scoring or through rebounding and assisting. That first game against San Jose State only took him 15 minutes to put up 13.5 fantasy points, which again, on this slate at $3,400, I'll take that. So definitely willing to play those two guys as my value plays as well. Tillin Pope returned from an injury last game against, 2 games ago. He returned from injury against UNLV. Hasn't done really anything in those 2 games since, but against San Jose State, he played 15 minutes, put up 15 fantasy points. So if he's back to full strength and this game gets to be in a blowout again, I do like the upside of Tillin Pope there at $3,800 as well. I don't mind in a GPP building a lineup off of a Nevada blowout and playing 1 or 2 of those Nevada value guys. Now on the San Jose State side, nobody really got there in that first game against Nevada. Now, also, this is a lost season for them. They're not good. They've only beaten 1 team in the Mountain West, and that's Air Force. And so they're still kind of figuring out what to do with their rotation, which is kind of just ludicrous for it being February 23rd. But Myron Amy is the one guy who's been the most consistent for them. He's been their usage leader on this season. He chucks a ton of shots. He can get peripheral stats as well. Last 3 games have all been 38 fantasy points or higher. In that game against Nevada, he only played 25 minutes, only put up 20 fantasy points. But here's the deal, though. It kind of seems like he sat because that game turned into a blowout. But since then, they played in some blowout games where he's gotten plenty of run and plenty of shot attempts. And so do they do what they did the first time that this game turns into a blowout? Or do they do what they've done recently where they just say, all right, Amy, just go out and do your thing and maybe we don't get beat by as bad. So I definitely think he's an intriguing play at 8,000. Definitely has some upside, definitely has some risk. Alvaro Cardenas returned from injury in San Jose State's last game against Boise State. He was not good. Played 26 minutes, did not make a shot from the field, put up 11 fantasy points in that game. Not great, but if he is back to being full strength, he definitely has an opportunity to very much hit value at a salary of only $6,000. In the first game against Nevada, neither of the forwards, Tibet Gorner, Trey Anderson, or Adrame Jiang, none of them hit value. Those are guys that tend to play a ton of minutes, but not in blowouts. So I'm just not really intrigued by any of them, but just wanted to get it out there that they are the rest of the starters. In the blowouts recently, like I said, this is a team that still plays a ton of guys. A lot of these guys, $3,000 and up, are still going to see some minutes, especially if this turns into a blowout. But the 2 that have done the most damage in the blowouts have been Christian Wise, as well as Latrell Davis. So maybe, just maybe, those 2 guys end up getting a little bit of run, whether it's a blowout or not. And maybe those 2 guys are guys that you could go to. But I'm much less interested in the San Jose State side than the Nevada side. All right, that does it for all 4 games, and that does it for the Friday, February 23rd slate of college basketball DFS. Now, if you want more information from me, you can follow me on Twitter at Mike's Money Picks. You can also join the Fantasy Corner Discord. Link is in the description on YouTube as well as the audio feed. I mentioned it earlier. It's the best place to go if you're looking for people to talk college basketball DFS with. Also, if you're looking to know who out of all this information makes my lineups, head on over to my Patreon, patreon.com/Mike's Money Picks. I have an article daily where I post my core plays as well as kind of my lineup strategy and attack strategy for the slate. I can't sit here and promise that you're just going to read it and win GPPs, but I can promise that you can read it, get some good sound information on, who the best plays are, how to build lineups, and how to start your own process of getting better at college basketball DFS. All right, so that does it for this episode, guys. If you like what you saw, please hit the like button for me. And if you're listening on audio, please rate and review. I cannot stress it enough how much that helps me when you guys do that. The likes on YouTube really help the algorithm to get the video noticed. The rate and review on audio helps the podcast show up in searches. A few months ago, you could search college basketball DFS and we wouldn't even show up. But now, because people have rated and reviewed and listened, now it's showing up at the very top of the charts if you search college basketball DFS. So those really do help out, and I really do appreciate when you guys do those. You guys are the absolute best and I really appreciate it. Also, we are trying to close in on 500 subscribers. We're currently sitting at 420. And so help me out. I want to get to 500 before the NCAA tournament. So if you have not subscribed already, please go ahead and do so. And again, I really do appreciate it. It helps me and shows me a lot of support when you guys do that. So if I've helped you in DFS, like it's an easy way to help me back a little bit is to like the video and subscribe to the channel. All right, so that does it for this episode, y'all. Like I said, hopefully I was able to give you guys the information that you need to build some winning lineups for this Friday slate. I can't make any promises on the Saturday slate, but if I am here for the Saturday slate, if you're subscribed, you'll get it. And if you follow me on Twitter, I'll be putting it out there on there as well. And also, whether I have an episode or not, I'll be in the Fantasy Corner Discord. So that does it for this episode, guys. Thank you guys for watching and listening to this point. Best of luck to you on the Friday slate, and I will see you next time.